Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, a time of reckoning for America's police forces. Acts of brutality caught on tape, but also acts of compassion. Now, along with calls for new laws and reform, some want cities to defund the police. We're joined by the leader of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers and the executive director of a progressive police foundation. Plus, let's not forget the pandemic. What will the days of protest mean to the spread of the virus? And what's the latest on a vaccine? Dr. William Schaffner is here with the very latest. And the week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the editors of Mediaite on who did well,
a way to end violence and brutality,
who did not.
Of a false flag provocation.
From the Law&Crime Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our viewers on YouTube Live and Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined today by my colleague at Law&Crime, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, it was 15 days ago today that George Floyd was killed in police custody in Minneapolis. Today he was laid to rest in Houston after an emotional church service that eulogized him.
And in those 2 weeks, Floyd has seen an extraordinary afterlife, if you will, as a symbol of police brutality and racial injustice. His name now a rallying cry for change. His death reigniting the Black Lives Matter movement across the country. Today's service, not far from where George Floyd grew up. It will include music, Bible readings, remembrances by family members, a video message from former Vice President Joe Biden.
Ladies and gentlemen, we can't turn away. We must not turn away. We cannot leave this moment thinking we can once again turn away from racism that stings at our very soul.
We've also seen the family come forward alongside the family of Michael Brown, the family of Botham Jean, the family of Ahmaud Arbery, all of them here standing strong with George Floyd's family. A somber homecoming for George Floyd in Houston, where the hearse carrying his casket arrived at the Floyd family church this morning for a public memorial attended by thousands.
All the families that are here with me today, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Arbery, it just hurt. Breonna Taylor, everybody. Thank y'all. We will get justice. We will get it. We will not let this door close.
And around the country today, we are hearing the term defund the police. The Minneapolis City Council decided that they would disband their police force. So we are fortunate to have with us today two leading experts. We have Charles Wilson, the chairman of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers, and along with Chuck Wexler, who is the chairman of the executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum. And gentlemen, let me start, Chuck, by asking you, what are we seeing around the country in terms of calls for reform and change in police departments?
Well, I think you're hearing a lot of support for reform. You know, you can't watch that video from Minneapolis and not feel a sense of, horror, if you will, at what Mr. Floyd went through. That is not what professional policing looks like. That is a failure. And it's sad. It's sad on so many respects. But number one, Mr. Floyd. But I think there's also an opportunity. The country is engaged in this issue. Policing is very important. And I think we have to take a hard look. We've come, good distance, but we have a lot more to do. How do we take this incident and make it an opportunity to really rethink how we do business? Policing is important. We can't walk away from policing, and that's the key. How do we take what we are feeling, what people are seeing? I've never seen anything like it. You have to go back to the 60s to see what we're seeing today. So there's a moment. Let's not squander it.
And Chuck, when they talk
Charles
about
Wilson,
defunding
let me
police,
ask you.
Oh, Brian is back with us.
Charles Wilson, let me ask you, as the chairman of the National Black Law Enforcement Officers Association, What's it like to be a black officer in the middle of all this?
Oh, it's hard. We have to balance both being a law enforcement officer and being a member of that community that is feeling oppressed. What people have to recognize is that this is nothing new for people in the black community. This has gone on for ages. We have often said to people, as well as our counterparts, that the institution of policing is inherently biased against people of color and low income, and was designed to be that way. When you look back on the overall history of policing, at least in America, this is what Black people have been forced to live with. As law enforcement officers, we try to balance the concept of working within the community, letting people know that we're there to treat them with dignity and respect, because that's the only way you can make strong relationships and bonds with people in the community.
And Chuck Wexler, you've led a group that has urged reforms in police departments around the country, but oftentimes you've had a lot of pushback from police unions. Now, with the demands for defunding the police, is there a better pathway to reforms? And how about the idea of defunding? What does that mean to you?
Oh, Brian, that's a really good question. You know, we had a terrible incident in Minneapolis. The world, it's interesting. We can say this, the world. I've heard from people from Northern Ireland. I've heard from Jordan. Everybody looks at the United States and they say, how could this happen? So at the very moment that the attention of the world is focused on us, that's not a time to step back from policing. So I think, when people say defunding, that means different things to different people. If what you're talking about are, can the police work with social service agencies and mental health agencies? Can the police work with agencies to get kids jobs so they don't have to get involved in crime? Can we do something about our education system? I think all of those things are great. But at the end of the day, when you're in crisis and you need help, you want a humane police officer responding. So, defunding the police isn't problem solving, it's walking away. Let's double down. This isn't about money. This is about commitment. So there's an outrage, and I think people are saying, they're angry at the police. I just think that as we think about the future, let's think about how do we work collaboratively. I'll give you an example of how I think we can work collaboratively. Let's suppose a mother has a child and he's out of control. He's not on his medication. Well, who do they call? They call 911. Now, are the police the best response to that? I don't think so. I think you want crisis intervention specialists, social workers, people from mental health community. That's who people want to respond. The question is, when that happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, will those agencies be there? Or could we do something like take one police officer, one mental health worker? They do this in places like New Haven and Providence, Rhode Island. So I think we should be creative in our problem solving.
Yeah. Yes.
Charles?
Like Chuck, I have been on the phone with people from Germany, from London. We have to find different ways to interact with people. We have to re-image our way of doing things. That idea of defunding or disbanding the police, not a good idea. And in fact, I have to take that same issue to my board next week because we've had so many people asking us for advice and opinions on it. We have to re-image policing so that people see us as guardians instead of warriors in the community. We have to be more critical about who we hire, how we hire, what we train, how we train, who supervises, how they're supervising, what policies and procedures are we putting in place to guide everything else that we do.
Chuck Wexler, you talk all the time with the most important and leading police chiefs in the country. Are they doing a good job of hiring minorities, people of color? And what happened to the notion of community policing?
Well, Brian, that's a really good question. One of the things we've learned for the last 30 years is we want our police departments to be reflective of their communities. So there's a real push to diversify the ranks. So these younger officers who are coming on, you want them to be minorities, you want them to be women, which is an interesting question too, because if they were to defund a police department, like they've talked about in Los Angeles or New York, 90% of a police department's budget is personnel. Only 10% is technology, training, technical assistance. So if you cut a police department's budget, what you're going to have to do is two things would probably happen since it's 90% personnel. You would not be hiring new people, and you'd have to lay off the first hired, which tends to be the younger officers, the diverse officers. It's a real challenge getting your workforce to be diverse. Today, what we've seen since Ferguson, recruitment and hiring is really down. More options for minorities and women. And think about it. If you're a minority and you're seeing what's happening with the police, is this the occupation you want? So that's a real challenge going forward. How are we going to get the best and the brightest to come forward? How are we going to make sure we have a diverse workforce? How are we going to recruit and compete with the private sector? When we talk about defunding the police, that has to be measured against, how important it is to have a diverse workforce.
Charles Wilson, let me ask you this. What about what they call the blue line? Cops don't want to give up other cops, criticize other cops. Isn't it time that officers spoke out about the people in their ranks that are doing a lot of violence and damage to the reputation of police forces?
I'm going to tell you absolutely yes. When you, as a police officer, observe someone else who is either acting inappropriately, acting illegally, using excessive force, or just point blank being disrespectful of the people that we are sworn to serve, and you do nothing, you say nothing, you are just as guilty as they are. They are, in a word, more dangerous to us as law enforcement officers than the people that we go out there and try to arrest. Here in Rhode Island, I'm working with legislators to institute state code that mandates the idea of duty to intervene. Now, what nobody knew at the time was that Minneapolis actually had it in their use of force policy.
Correct.
But see, if the problem is, if it's in policy and you don't enforce your policy, it does you no good. That's why we're looking
Absolutely.
at
And Chuck
here.
Wexler, yeah.
That's why we're looking here.
Absolutely, you're right about it. Yeah.
Embedded in state code.
And so finally, Chuck Wexler, that's part of the issue within the policy, but it's not being enforced. What's the good of a policy?
Well, you know, I think Charles raised a good point on duty to intervene. We had our guiding principles on use of force in 2016. Number one was the sanctity of human life. Number two was the duty to intervene. Number three was a duty to render first aid. You go back to the Rodney King incident 30 years ago, and the big takeaway, there's two takeaways. Obviously, number one, the brutality against Rodney King, but number two, the role that Sergeant Stacy Keene had that day and his responsibility. That was 30 years ago. And so departments, and that's where our best practice came from, is that was one of the best practices. But in Minneapolis, you have a situation where the officer involved, Chavez, 19-year veteran, field training officer, he's the one that is on Mr. Floyd's neck. The two officers who are around him are both four-day rookies. So you have a cultural issue where you want those officers to intervene. How do they do that when the person who is causing the damage, is acting wrong in a way that's a disaster? That is both a cultural issue and a policy issue. We can change the policy. What's going to make a difference is when every police officer recognizes in these situations, I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to save that man's life, and I'm going to save that cop's career. There's a win-win situation. Rodney King incident happened because poor supervision and a culture issue. And this incident 30 years later happened. But if in either of those situations, if officers had intervened to stop, it would be incredible. Huge point, Charles.
Absolutely. Well, Chuck Wexler, yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you, Chuck Wexler from the Police Executive Research Foundation and Charles Wilson from the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers. Thank you both for being here. Fascinating insights. Appreciate it very much. Coming up, the race for a vaccine. Let's not forget there's a pandemic. And all those police videos of officers acting so brutally. What will happen to them? Is there a way to prosecute them? When we come back, you're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. Well, this week it was a sign of the determination and the passion of tens of thousands of Americans who chose to go into the streets to protest what's been happening, oftentimes forgetting social distancing, not wearing masks. Let's not forget there is a pandemic, and we still don't know what the impact will be of all those protests on the streets involving so many Americans. And we also learned this week how little we know about what's next with this pandemic, with major confusion and disinformation still coming out. I talked earlier today with Dr. William Schaffner of the Vanderbilt University Medical School. Dr. Schaffner, thank you so much for joining us. Yesterday, the WHO said people who didn't have symptoms only rarely could pass on the virus. Today, they're backing off that statement. What's the fact, and what's going on with the confusion at the WHO?
Well, the WHO certainly did provide confusion, and I'm so glad they're backing off, Brian, because we know that people who have no symptoms at all, despite the fact that they're infected with the virus, and people who have only minor symptoms but don't consider themselves sick can be out and about spreading this viral infection. In fact, we think they cause a substantial amount of the contagiousness of this virus. And so I'm glad the WHO is walking that back.
And as you know, Dr. Schaffner, over the last 3 or 4 months, they first said there was no human-to-human transmission, and then they actually suggested masks weren't that helpful. Now they're saying rare with the asymptomatic, backing that off. Is there a problem with the WHO in getting their story straight?
There may be some problem with the WHO, but there's a larger issue, of course. As we have a new infection on the human scene that's spreading around the world, we've never seen this virus before. We always tell people the more we learn, we will update our recommendations. And so there's been that sort of process, which frankly is hard for some people to understand, that yes, what I knew last week and told you may have to be modified because since then I've learned some more.
And so we've seen in the U.S. in some places reopenings, in other states a new spike of infectious diseases, and around the world, especially in the Americas, in the southern part of the hemisphere, the thing is raging still.
Oh, there isn't any doubt that COVID virus is still running around the world. And as you say, in the southern hemisphere, where they're having their winter while we're having our summer, the virus is spreading widely in Brazil, Chile, Peru, and other countries. So that may be a harbinger of what's to come when we start getting our winter again, along with influenza. So we're likely to have a double-barreled viral respiratory season coming up this year.
And do you think, Dr. Schaffner, it will be as devastating as this first wave of the COVID-19 illnesses?
I think it could be quite as serious because remember, the virus hit us toward the end of our influenza season. This next go around, it will have a chance to have a run-in along with influenza. And if both viruses are out there making people sick, that will put a special strain on the healthcare system. All the more reason, make a resolution right now. Let's all get vaccinated against flu. We'll have that vaccine in hand, and we can do something about that infection.
And give us the latest from what you know about a possible vaccine for the coronavirus, for the COVID-19 illness.
Well, Brian, everybody's working very hard on that. I hesitate to make predictions, although there is a hope that perhaps early in 2021, or at least sometime next year, we will have at least one vaccine available to us. But then when that happens, the hard work just begins. It's likely to require 2 doses, which means giving many, many people 2 doses of a vaccine and creating that sort of a delivery system and actually persuading people to take the vaccine will still take a great deal of work.
And you mentioned the people who have been hesitant to take even the flu vaccine. This could be much more difficult, right? And do you think when it comes, it will be proven safe, it'll be tested well enough, given the accelerated pace we're seeing right now?
We're working very fast, and we're doing things simultaneously that we used to do in sequence, but we're not cutting corners. We will only have vaccines available for the general public that are shown to be effective and safe. How effective they are remains to be seen. We need that information so we can communicate that with complete clarity and honesty.
It is amazing to see dozens and dozens of possible vaccines now going through the testing stages. There are several, though, that are in the front of the pack, aren't there?
Yes, there are several at the front of the pack, although, as you say, there are it's been estimated 100 scientific groups around the world trying to create vaccines. There are 4 or 5 that are already in more advanced clinical trials, and we await the results of those trials as we go forward. It's an exciting time. There are a number of different possibilities, and perhaps more than one horse will come in.
And it's quite a tribute, I think, to the medical and scientific community that they're able to do this so quickly with some coordination, it seems, some cooperation.
Everybody is being quite open, within limits, of course, but nonetheless, an awful lot of scientific work had been done before COVID hit the scene. And I know for a fact that the moment the Chinese investigators announced the genetic structure, the genome of the virus, our investigators at the National Institutes of Health within hours began developing and working on a vaccine.
That's an amazing story. Dr. William Schaffner, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure, Brian.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. But first, the difficulty of getting justice for police officers who misbehave and who kill. We'll talk with two lawyers and get a reality check. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. Well, we've all seen those videos, not very many good, but a lot of them bad and ugly, raising difficult questions about police misconduct and the issue of whether police who misbehave, badly misbehave, can ever be prosecuted. So many of the videos seem to show the police as if they feel they'll never be held accountable.
We have updates to that show of force against peaceful protesters yesterday in Lafayette Park across from the White House.
You can see police here now firing tear gas into the crowd. They are trying to push these folks back.
They're firing tear gas canisters towards the crowd. Protesters are throwing them back. The White House is literally 200 yards in that direction. Everyone's been hit by it. It's just incredibly painful right now.
Okay, stop the car! Stop! Stop! Okay, I'm getting out! I'm getting out! Stop! 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 I'm getting out! Stop! I'm getting out! We're across with American in the park.
And so the question is, can police who misbehave, can they be held accountable in a court of law? Joining me to talk about that, in addition to my colleague Rhonda Schwartz, are two other colleagues of mine from Law and Crime, Mike Korbanix in New Jersey and Eklund Mercy in Georgia. Thank you both for being here. Let me start with you, if I could, Eklund. You've seen those videos, but oftentimes the police get away with it.
Yeah, oftentimes because of qualified immunity. And it essentially just gives officers carte blanche to do what they want to do. There's that video in which you had two able-bodied officers, push a 75-year-old man, and there was no reason for it. So if you're lethal, if your threshold for an actual threat is a 75-year-old man, and you find it in your mind that it's okay to push him with all your force, and then when you make bond and after you're finally arrested, for you to get a hero's welcome, that's the type of world that we live in today. So they can get away with anything. At this point, it seems that I feel like white America needs to look inward and figure out where is their conscience. They ask us about peaceful protests and say that we should have peaceful protests, but never once nobody has ever told us what will make you feel that we're worthy. What will make us human to you? We told you that this is happening. You see that it's happening. What else do you need for us to tell you, hey, we're worthy, we're human? You know, you guys have to have that conversation because you see that officers are overstepping their bounds every single day now. People are dying, saying they can't breathe, and because their skin has been weaponized. And it's okay, it's justified. So I feel that the question shouldn't be with Black people, it should be with white people. Like, what will it take for you to find us worthy of life? What will it take for you to find us worthy of the inalienable rights that we all possess, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What can we do? Or what can you guys do within yourselves to be okay with it?
Right, all true. Mike Korbanix, let me ask you, give us a reality check. What actually happens in the courtroom when officers are held accountable They have the videos, and too often they seem to be found not guilty or acquitted, or sometimes the charges are dropped. What's going on in the court?
Well, it's always very difficult because, as Eklund said, there is a perception out there that police officers, because they are police officers, and the people that are accusing them have been accused of a crime, it's a very difficult hurdle for prosecutors to get over when they're presenting a case to a jury. I mean, we see videotapes that last maybe anywhere from 1 to 15 minutes in many of these cases. And there's a reason why they take months and months to try. There's a very long process that has to go on. It's very difficult for the prosecutor's offices because I think for them to remove themselves, since they mostly deal daily with the police officers within their own jurisdiction. So I think there needs to be some thought on the review as to how these cases are prosecuted, and perhaps some sort of special units that are removed from the daily court actions, because police officers are appearing in court on other cases. They're considered to be on the government and the side of right. And we have a embedded thought in jurors because that's ultimately who makes the decision of the jurors. And it's very difficult for the state when they're prosecuting to get over the fact that they're police officers. In these people's perceptions, many who haven't had run-ins. When I'm saying this, I'm talking about specific police officers who do wrong. I'm not speaking about police officers in general. I'm speaking about those few people who tarnish the reputation of the people who are doing their job accordingly. But it makes it very difficult for these prosecutions because there's already preconceived notions before it gets to trial.
And Eklund, Mercy, you mentioned qualified immunity. The Supreme Court's going to hear arguments about that this week. But give us in just a minute or so, because we have to go on to our next one, give us a sense of what that means. What is qualified immunity?
Qualified immunity kind of popped up around the Civil Rights Act when the Civil Rights Act passed. So although we don't have slavery, and although we have, the Civil Rights Act, hey, we have a way to be able to protect officers from police brutality claims, from not only police brutality claims, from civil claims, from criminal claims that when done during their course of work. It's virtually impossible to win a case with qualified immunity. They are protected. And another thing is that not only do they have qualified immunity, they are free to do whatever. We have Dennis Chauvin had over 70 complaints in his file and was still, at the day of George Floyd's death, was training 2 officers. So that goes to show you that not only do they have qualified immunity, they're protecting these types of officers. So although not a lot of officers are bad and things of that nature, Dennis Chauvin was training 2 officers and he had 70 complaints and was still allowed to roam the streets. And the 70 complaints are the ones that we know of. We even have case law that says that people have sued to try to get a higher IQ. There's an IQ limit to even be an officer. Like, the whole system needs to be revamped because they're specifically putting officers that can portray this systematic racism upon these towns, these cities, and these neighborhoods. Like, Dennis Chauvin should have never been an officer, and you can see that now.
You're absolutely right, and this is why the calls for reform may not even go far enough, and there's all this talk about defunding the police. Well, Eklund, Mercy, I want to thank you very much, and Mike Korbanek's important insights into what's going on. I appreciate very much you being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. Coming up next, the winners and losers in the media this week. See if you agree with the editors of Mediaite. You're watching the Law&Crime Trial Network. And we wrap up our program tonight with this week's winners and losers in the media as compiled by Mediaite. We're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, part of the Dan Abrams media empire, which, of course, also includes our Law and Crime Network. And Aidan, a tumultuous week for the media this week.
Always is, yes, Brian. We've got a couple of winners and losers. I'm excited to get to them.
Yes. Let's start with the Washington Post. You declared a winner.
Yeah, so we have two reporters at the Washington Post here. You might not know their names. They're not sort of prominent figures on the masthead, but they did a really interesting story that we caught that took a look at various contributions, charitable contributions that the wealthy have made. Now, one of the people that they looked at as part of this piece was Jeff Bezos. Now, he is the founder of Amazon, a billionaire by, hundreds of times over, and he actually owns the Washington Post. So they took a look at his contributions to the fight against coronavirus and saw that he had donated a total of $125 million to the relief effort. Now, that sounds like an impressive number, but when you actually look at his net worth, which is close to $150 billion, it actually doesn't add up to that much. And their reporting found that if you compared that number to that of a median household, a median American household, it actually comes around about to $85, which doesn't sound like a lot. So, this was a really interesting report. And the fact that these two Washington Post reporters made Jeff Bezos, who is effectively their boss, the focus of it, is a win for them. It's a win for the Washington Post. And, aside from his charitable giving, it's a win that Jeff Bezos has that level of independence between himself and the newspaper that he owns.
Absolutely. I can tell you firsthand, going against the boss or against the owner or the big man is always difficult for a reporter, and hats off to them and to Marty Barron for running the story. Next, the loser, Barry Weiss.
Right. So Barry Weiss is part of the opinion pages at the New York Times. Now, we've heard a lot about the New York Times opinion section this week. I remember, last week on the show, we were speaking about it a lot. This is all continued fallout from their publication of an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, which was headlined "Send in the Troops" and called for the military to intervene in the protests across the United States. Now, a lot of New York Times staffers objected to that piece being run. They objected to it on factual grounds, and they also thought that it put their lives in danger, given that there was fears that there would be a military crackdown on not just protesters, but reporters. Now, Barry Weiss weighed in on this on Twitter. She's often had sort of controversial takes on these sorts of subjects compared to the rest of the New York Times staff. She described the tensions at the New York Times over this op-ed as a civil war between what she's called the mostly young wokes at the paper and the mostly 40-plus liberals who are disagreeing over whether or not voices like Tom Cotton should be tolerated at the newspaper. Now, the merits of Barry Weiss's argument aside, a lot of people at the paper thought that was a complete mischaracterization of what they described as the thoughtful debate that was going on within the paper about the publication of this op-ed. She was called lazy and intellectually dishonest by people at her own paper, and not an insignificant amount. A lot of people from the New York Times criticized Barry Weiss over the way that she described the civil war at the paper, which she basically cast as sort of a clash between PC liberals who needed a safe space from Tom Cotton's views and old school media types that perhaps were more tolerant of his views. Now, right. Well, we're not looking at the merits of her debate,
yeah.
Go for it.
Per facts. But let's jump ahead here to another loser, James Bennett, because it ties right in.
Yeah. So James Bennett was the editorial page editor at the New York Times. So he oversees the entire opinion section, and he was actually responsible for Tom Cotton's op-ed being published. Now, here's the thing. He didn't actually read Tom Cotton's op-ed before it was published. Now, that came out in the aftermath of the controversy over this op-ed being published by the New York Times. James Bennett came clean and said that he hadn't read it. There was a review of Tom Cotton's op-ed, and that review by the New York Times claimed that there were several factual errors in the op-ed and that its tone was off and not in line with the paper. and they said that they should never have published it. They appended a big editor's note at the top of the op-ed. And after several days of that controversy, after James Bennett admitting that he hadn't read this very incendiary column before it was published, he resigned on Sunday night. Now, that is a huge story at the newspaper and for media in general, because James Bennett was widely seen as a potential successor to Dean Baquet, who's the current top editor at the New York Times. So it's a real reordering of the masthead at the New York Times, and it's a huge loss and blow for James Bennett, who was at a pretty, one of the most senior editor positions at the Times a week ago, and is now out of a job.
He walked the plank, essentially. Your next winner, Mitt Romney. Tell us about that. Let's first take a look at this video.
Sure.
A way to end violence and brutality and to make sure that people understand that Black Lives Matter.
Mitt just wants to make sure that Americans understand, get it through their thick heads, that Black Lives Matter. As if Americans didn't know that.
So there was Senator Romney marching in the Black Lives Matter, being taken apart by Tucker Carlson at Fox.
Right, and we thought that criticism from Tucker Carlson was harsh and a little bit misguided. I think it was fairly stunning to see Mitt Romney not only march with these protesters, but also declare multiple times in interviews with the Washington Post, on camera during these protests, that Black Lives Matter. Now, Brian, I can't even imagine that we're at a point where there is a Republican senator that is uttering the words Black Lives Matter, which I feel like is something that would be unheard of just a couple of years ago. This is Mitt Romney basically stripping what should be an uncontroversial statement that Black Lives Matter, but stripping it of its sort of culture war baggage that it's had for the past couple of years. And it was really refreshing to see a Republican senator do that. I don't think that the criticism from Tucker Carlson was in any way warranted or accurate. Tucker Carlson has been criticizing these protests from the start. So it's no surprise to see him go after Mitt Romney, particularly because Mitt Romney has been critical of President Donald Trump, who also criticized Mitt Romney for marching in these protests. It's good to see the senator do that. Will Hurd was the only other Republican that we really saw march in these. He's a congressman from Texas. So we gave Mitt Romney the media win, not only for marching, but for also getting criticism from Tucker Carlson there.
Absolutely, almost like a badge of honor. And finally, we've got 1 minute for a loser, OAN, One America Network. Take a look at this video.
The latest tensions at the Buffalo Police Department could be a result of a false flag provocation by far-left group Antifa. According to the conservative Treehouse Saturday, 75-year-old protester Martin Gugino, shoved by the Buffalo police at last week's protest, is a well-known activist bragging on social media about far-left views.
All right, Aiden, we've got 30 seconds there. Spreading some conspiracy theories that just don't hold up, right? OAN?
Yeah, that's One American News Network, a very pro-Trump conspiracy theory-minded network that was spreading this wild theory about that protester. That theory was touted by Trump on Twitter, became a huge controversy for the day. It's a terrible network. It was a terrible segment. It's bad that the president promoted it. I'll leave it at that.
All right. Aidan McLaughlin, editor-in-chief of Mediaite, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to all of you for watching us for this special report of Brian Ross Investigates. And thanks to our team at Law&Crime Network for getting us on the air and off.